Hello everyone and welcome to this video, which is in our Deep Blue Rediscovered series. I'm Grandmaster Matthew Sadler and we are up to the game Deep Blue against Garry Kasparov, game 4 of the 1997 match. So after two tumultuous games, the third game had been a tough fight. Garry with white had been pressing somewhat, but actually, the game had probably never left the realm of equality, but just looked like Garry was pressing. And now Deep Blue had white against Garry, and the question was, what was Garry going to play? His Rai Lopez had not worked very well. Deep Blue had looked very comfortable in that, so Garry had to find something else. He wasn't willing to play a Najdorf Sicilian, which might have been a sensible thing to do, judging from what we discussed in the introduction, but Garry didn't do that. After 1e4, he played the move c6, and Yasser Seirawan said, the moment that Garry reached for his c-pawn, I was certain that we would see a Sicilian defence. It was quite a surprise when the pawn stopped at c6 for a Caro-Kann. Reminds me a little bit of that story of Michael Tal's little joke against Fischer, where he first played his pawn to c6 and then moved it forward to c5 with a smile. So, quite funny really. But, c4, c6. But Garry's idea was not to play a Caro-Kann. After d4, he played the move d6. So, I think that the Deep Blue was now into its extended book. And actually, there are a few moves in Deep Blue's book here. Knight c3 had a weighting of 12. And f4 had a weighting of 7. I'm pretty sure that Garry would have played d5 in this position and tried to punch holes in that white centre if white had done that. Strangely enough, in this case, Deep Blue preferred knight f3, which had a weight of 5. Slightly surprising in some ways. So after knight f6, knight c3, and then bishop g4 from Garry. So, I mean, g6 would actually be, I guess, probably the best line. That's simply heading back to some sort of piets. But bishop g4 was quite consistent. And, I mean, Garry's going for, some sort of structure where he's going to play e6 and d5. Try and get some sort of French Caro-Kann structure where the bishop is outside the pawn chain. H3 was played by Deep Blue. That was weight 15, so its extended book was really pushing it towards that. And actually, in Deep Blue's extended book, bishop h5 had a weight of 25, which is quite interesting because this was what Deep Blue was expecting in its PV. So it was really not afraid at all of giving up bishops for knights, in actual fact, despite what it seemed in the first game. Simply that there was a lot in the Deep Blue book that was sort of telling it not to exchange off bishops for knights. But this was Deep Blue's PV, which was quite interesting. Castles, queen c7, king b1, bishop g7, and now g4. So pretty aggressive, Pretty aggressive. Deep Blue's idea, and it's worthwhile seeing that g4 idea because. After bishop h5, bishop d3 was played, which I'm assuming was a weighted move. I don't actually seem to have any data on that. The interesting thing is that for the modern engines, g4, bishop g6, queen e2 is a massive advantage. They give it 1.58, and dragons smashing stockfish, and stockfish is smashing dragons. So it's quite painful. The idea is after e6 we go h4, h5, g5, knight fd7, and then d5. We stop black from getting this this d6 to d5 solid centre, and after here and bishop h3, white's doing pretty well. yeah, I mean, you're just simply going to go bishop e3 and move the knight away most likely, and then maybe some stage play f4 or just line up on the light squares. Just very unpleasant position for black. But bishop d3 was played by Deep Blue, and after e6, then queen e2, and yeah, Yasser Seirawan said Deep Blue's operator played this move quickly, a clear sign that the game had transposed back into the computer's opening book library. Yeah, extended book, yeah, so queen e2 had a weighting of 15. So, yeah, it's a bit of a shame, really, because g4, that was, again, what the engines were looking for, and it led to a lot of white wins in my games. So, yeah, again, a little bit unfortunate there. Oh, there was a very nice little game. I can show you what sort of happened. Bishop g6, g5 straight away. Knight fd7. The engine's not daring to put that knight out on h5. Could very easily get attacked. Bishop retreating to e2, and then the knight moves away. So knight fd7, h4, bishop h5, and now d5 again, blocking that d5 idea. Takes g6, bishop e2, bishop g7, knight d4, queen b6, knight f5. I think these were dragon against stockfish games. Totally crazy what's happening there. But yeah, I mean, white stands pretty well, but if you're stockfish, then you'll somehow manage to draw that. That was the basic idea. But yeah, I mean, quite interesting there as well. But I mean, these gaining space like this is really the best way to play against these sort of systems. But somehow, yeah, queen e2, another example where human input is pushing Deep Blue into something where you sort of feel that it would probably have played a lot more aggressively if it had been given free rein there. So queen e2 played, and now d5 from Garry. So he's got his structure here. He's got the bishop out of the pawn chain. Yeah, the one question is, is he going to get away with it, or is white going to be able to gain plenty of time on the bishop, gain plenty of space, and put black into trouble? But yeah, I mean, e takes d5 actually was Deep Blue's main move in the extended book. But and it had a weight of 21, so it's quite astonishing that Deep Blue tried something else. But it played the move bishop g5, and Garry played bishop e7. Bizarrely enough, in Deep Blue's PV, we have bishop f3, g takes f3. Very reminiscent of a game that Michal Tal played against Michal Botvinnik in. I think it was their first World Championship match, 1960, where Tal could basically do anything, and it always seemed to work against Botvinnik. But yeah, pretty impressed by that, really, that Deep Blue was considering this. But Garry just played the very solid bishop e7, and Deep Blue is now out of its extended book. e5 was played. Yeah, sort of all right. The engines were playing g4, bishop g6, and e5, so kind of transposing, but playing like this with h4. So not swapping off on e7 and not swapping off on g6, which I think is a pretty decent way of playing, really. And well, what did I have? Yeah, I had some crazy game here between Stockfish and Dragon, where Dragon just ends up giving material, of course. Very always likes doing that. So now bishop e7, now that you've exposed the dark squares, knight b5, and then Stockfish just sacrificed Dragon just sacrificed the rook on c7. It's got this knight e5 idea. Queen takes c5, knight c6, queen g3, takes, rook c8, knight b5, and c takes d4, which is, yeah, incredibly interesting, actually. The big problem is that this knight is somewhat out of play. Queen b4 check is threatened. And after castles, we got queen b4, a4, a6, knight a3, queen b2, rook b1, queen c3, with a very weird position. It's 3 pawns for the piece. You're also attacking this one. And this queen, is just keeping hold of the knight and also the rook, so you can't go rook b7 because of queen a1. And black's just planning to play something like knight b4 and consolidate and then try and roll these pawns forward. Dragon held this against Stockfish without too much trouble. So very interesting idea. But you know, I think that in general this plan of playing e5 and of playing h4, not swapping off the bishops, just letting you know, leaving black in suspense, being as flexible as possible. That's a much better plan, but this was something that Deep Blue struggled with. Deep Blue was very often just resolving stuff straight away. If stuff could get exchanged, then Deep Blue was tending to do that a little bit earlier than modern engines, and I think that's, you know, still was one of the weaknesses of its play there. So, but e5 blocking up the centre. So in principle, Garry, you know, should be quite happy. He's thinking, blocked centre. We're going to play on the wings. But I mean, the one thing is that, you know, Deep Blue doesn't play the best moves here. So bishop e7's a little bit early, and after bishop g6, taking on g6 also feels very early. And Yasser Seirawan said this was a clear mistake. In actual fact, you know, the modern engines say that it's still about 0.00, so it's not such a bad move, but yeah, it does feel again like, you know, it's giving black really what he wants, and you know, I don't think that black would be taking on d3 the next move, so you could just be a little bit more flexible. But yeah, Garry played actually a slightly surprising idea. I think fg6 would be the natural move for, yeah, human grandmasters, certainly against human players. I don't know whether Garry saw it differently against Deep Blue. Of course, you know, Garry knows all these themes. Very common in stuff like the Slav, for example, that you or even the Open Lopez. There's a very famous Rubinstein game with that, where you take away from the centre. Very unusual, but it bolsters your king side. And here, of course, it gives you the open f file, and we've got a loose knight, not protected by the g pawn, in front of an f2 pawn. So it's quite nice. I mean, Stockfish gives it minus 0.05 for black. You know, queen e3 castles and c5, takes knight c6 with, you know, pretty decent position for black. I mean, I'd rather be black in this position, even if the engines you know, think that it's just a draw. So yeah, you know, thoroughly agree with Yasser on that. By the way, I'm not sure whether I've been sounding all the time like I'm criticising Yasser's commentary. I do feel that Yasser's commentary inside chess, I found it very, very interesting, you know, and I really enjoyed it very much. And you know, you're very grateful to any player who puts himself out on a limb and says this is good, this is bad. You know, I mean, it's so yeah. You know, if I'm criticising his comments or whatever, yeah, just you know, I don't mean it unpleasantly or anything. You know, I do enjoy his commentary very much, and very grateful that I'd seen it and found it back. So just thought I'd better say that. Now, the one thing about it is that, you know, in this position, you know, Deep Blue didn't just sit around, and I think this is really the strength of it, and I think this is what maybe surprised Garry a little bit. He was sort of expecting, okay, we get a blocked centre position, and then the engine won't do very much at all, and I'll just increase my position, and I'll get an awful lot of free moves before I have to worry about anything. But Deep Blue played the move h4, and well, you're going to see in its next few moves that it's going to castle, it's going to play the rook over to g1, it's looking for h5. Not necessarily the plan that I would have chosen, but the engines think that it's pretty much okay, and you know, it's kind of doing something, and doing something positive, you know, not just hanging around and waiting for stuff to happen, and that's pretty impressive. You know, that's again, that was not something that we particularly associated with engines of the time, to be able to play fixed center positions in this sort of positive and dynamic way. So yeah, that was really something I think pretty new with Deep Blue, certainly to be able to do it against a player like Garry. So there were a lot of manoeuvres there that were possible. Knight b6 was one idea, followed by knight 8 d7, just to play like that. Or you could also play, you know, for a6. A6 and then c5. Yeah, what Garry went for, he just went for knight a6, and after castles played castle queenside. And here Deep Blue played the move rook dg1. I mean, actually, the engines were looking more for this. They were looking to go queen e3, castles, and then if you give white a move, white's going to play the move knight e2 and just bolster up the d4 pawn, so that when you go c5 you can play c3 and recapture with a pawn on d4. That was kind of what the engines were doing, and that would most likely have been the plan that I would have thought of, you know. And but Deep Blue was thinking about that sort of stuff from time to time, but then, you know, it was very much focused on you know, pushing on the king side and making stuff happen there. So yeah, you know, pretty impressive. I mean, you know, in some ways, you know, I was thinking about this, and we'll see a little moment later as well. But there are quite parallels with AlphaZero somehow, because AlphaZero was actually very keen on block center positions, and then you're playing with the wings, you know, particularly with the rook's pawn. Now you don't see the rook's pawn being used quite as strongly by Deep Blue, but still, you know, very strong wing play in block center positions. So yeah, quite interesting somehow. You know, really, you know, I really do wonder, you know, if if there hadn't been so much acrimony in the match in the end, and if IBM maybe had thought, well, why not? Let's let's take on the world with Deep Blue. Whether we might have got much further with engine chess much more quickly, because I definitely think that the people behind Deep Blue and the way that it played, I think it had just huge potential somehow. Yeah, bit of a shame. So knight c7 played by Garry there, just taking things nice and easy, and it's flexible, right? I mean, he's covering b5, so you might go c5 without fearing knight b5, but also protecting e6 and playing f6. So king b1, once again the engines want queen e3, knight e2, c3, that sort of stuff. But Deep Blue playing king b1. I mean, I'm guessing that this is very much to do with the king safety algorithm, that we mentioned earlier. That Murray Campbell said that they used machine learning techniques to sort of determine with some automatic tuning that king safety algorithms were too low for Deep Blue, and this was a sort of move that resulted. But it's it's absolutely fine. I mean, originally Deep Blue was just going to play h5. It was just at the move itself that it played king b1, because I think that Garry thought quite a long time over knight c7. So f6, the best move according to the engines. But here Yasser is really very anti this move. I mean, I'm a little bit shocked by what Yasser says, because I mean, it looks a very reasonable and natural move to me. But it's interesting. Yasser's had a very clear idea about how to play against engines. He said, a disgusting move by Garry. If I were his trainer, I'd whack him on his hands for reaching for his f-pawn. Deep Blue is fishing for a plan and doesn't know what to do. I'm not 100% sure about that. I mean, I think that Deep Blue would have played h5 on the king side and and gone for it somehow. Why not let the computer fish around for a plan? Garry should be improving his queenside possibilities by quietly building up his position. King b8, vacating the c file, preparing c5, or b6 and king b7, c5. Also, finally, if Garry wants to be cruel and stop any of Deep Blue's active kingside options, he can play rook h6 and rook dh8, and then turn his attentions to the queen side. My suspicion is that Deep Blue would have been left with making pass or null moves, waiting for an active plan. What is particularly offensive about the text is that it hits the e5 pawn where white is the strongest, as opposed to the base d4 pawn. Now Deep Blue has a clear strategic plan: recover the previous waiting moves and return to the centre and support the e5 square. In general, I'd adorn Garry's move with a second question mark. Does Garry understand how to play against computers? The text tells me he does not. Yeah, really strong words there from Yasser. I mean, I understand them. I mean, what Yasser wants to do is not scare Deep Blue into action, but just make lots of strengthening moves and just quietly advance. I'm not sure that this would have worked against Deep Blue, to be honest, but it's definitely an idea. I mean, I think the one thing that kind of that Yasser underestimates, really, I mean, is the dynamism that Black gets. When the F file gets opened, you're attacking against this guy and this pawn. So, you know, there are weaknesses everywhere. I mean, I can really understand that that Garry did this. The only thing I suppose you could say is that, you know, Garry's game match plan was to keep things tight and avoid, you know, giving Deep Blue any targets to aim at. And this f6 move is not really fitting in with that. The ideas that Yasser suggests would have been better from that point of view. Deep Blue, by the way, was expecting King b8. So when it was preparing to play Queen e3 actually, and you know, just probably going to get that knight out of the way and sort of protect the queen side. But quite interesting, you know, very interesting comments from Yasser, and I mean, I do like this move rook h6. I think this is quite nice. I tried a few engine games with it, and the engines were not too disappointed with it. They were sort of combining plans somehow. The point is, you know, you can still go h5 when even when you're going there, because the g7 pawn is hanging on there. But you know, it was quite interesting. This knight's coming to f4 to put a bit more pressure on. You know, could have been a complicated game as well. But yeah, it's very. I mean, it sort of shows the type of player that Yasser was, and yeah, the interesting and original ideas that he had. So yeah, I thought it was a very interesting comment. So f6 played, e takes f6 played. The engine's at 0.00. Yeah, Yasser says, I think, you know, and this is a very good point. If we go back to move 12 for a moment, Garry had the opportunity to play f takes g6 with a similar idea of playing down the f-file, but white wouldn't have the e5 pawn because there was a pawn still in e5. So, yeah, I mean, I understand. This doesn't make that much sense from that point of view, but I think it's still a decent move. G takes f6 was also possible. G5 looks obvious, but I mean, you go rook df8 and you've still got this counterplay around the on the f file. So you know, the engines seem to think that there were, you know, quite a few decent ways of playing. Yeah, rook g3 played, and now, yeah, all sorts of ways again. Garry went for rook d8, which to be honest is the most natural. The engines were looking at rook he8, but yeah, rook d8 feels very natural. Keep the rook on the h file, also able to come to the f file, and you know, look to play e5. So rook e1, rook hf8, and yeah. Some interesting things there. Actually, yeah, some very interesting things were in Deep Blue's main line, which, yeah, again, gives you something like a shadow of Alpha Zero somehow. Because after Queen f4 in this position, Alpha Zero, sorry, Deep Blue was looking to play the move a4. Wow, King b8, a5. Very Alpha Zero-y, don't you think? It's not a move chosen, by the way, by any of modern engines, so it's maybe not the very best, not quite well timed, but still, you know, very interesting, and quite an interesting line. The other interesting line after Queen f4, this was the main line that Deep Blue was analysing, was the move King a1, and it's not as clueless as Yasser suggested it would be. The idea being to go c3 and then knight bd2, with the knight protecting the, you know, the other knight on f3, and dealing with that pressure along the f file, which again, yeah, you know, it's not chosen by any of the engines, but yeah, you know, it's an interesting plan, right? I mean, it really shows some real strategy from Deep Blue. So yeah, very impressed by that, I have to say. But rook f8 played, and now the move knight d1. Just protecting f2, so this knight on f3 is ready to move. And now Garry played an excellent move. He played the move e5. And I mean, the engines are doing that as well. They were playing Queen f4 first and then e5. But the basic idea of sacrificing this pawn just to free the pieces and yeah, and hopefully eventually be able to grab a pawn back. You know, that was definitely what the engines were wanting. So e5, d takes f5, and Queen f4. Just having a look to see. Yeah, and by the way, yeah, knight d1. By the way, just looking through Deep Blue's logs there, knight d1. this took a long time for Deep Blue to decide on. Normally it was quite, quick to find the move it liked, and didn't change so much. But here it looked at quite a few different moves after Rook F8. Knight A4 was one idea, Queen E3, H5, before it settled for Knight D1. So E5 played, D takes E5, and Queen F4. And what has Garry got for the sacrifice pawn? Well, I mean, this pawn can't move forward there. It's held by these. It's attacked as well, so that sort of pins down some pieces. And black also gets can line up on the pawn there, but also gets some extra squares there for the pieces. I mean, basically, you just can't imagine that white will be able to hold on to that e pawn for in the long term. Once again, Garry sort of hoping that this material advantage for white will sort of fool Deep Blue into thinking you're a lot better. And just and then maybe start playing passively. But again, Deep Blue, I think, was assessing this pretty well, because it felt that it needed to take action. It couldn't just sit still. So play the move A3, Knight E6 from Garry, and then Knight C3. And interestingly enough, one of the engine main moves here was the move A5. Which you might not understand. You really only understand, I think, if you saw if you know what Deep Blue's next move. Because after Knight DC5, Deep Blue played the pretty astonishing B4. And we discussed this in game one already. Garry looked very puzzled and happy by the new opportunities. I think that this is still referring, I think we discussed this bug in game one. What Feng-hsiung said was that in general, king safety algorithm was making Deep Blue be more careful about its king. But there seemed to be something that if Deep Blue had a chance to make the opponent's king weaker, then that overrode any concerns that it had about its own king. And I think that this is, you'll see in the next few moves what happens, because that's really what Deep Blue goes for. It goes to expose the opponent's king. I mean, actually, this move is not bad. It's still 0.00. It's not the move that the engines would play nowadays. I think Queen D1 was their preferred move, and there was also a game with H5 as well. But it's not disastrous. It's sort of the engine saying, "Well, yeah, all right." So B4, Knight D7, Queen D3, Queen F7. So Deep Blue hitting that pawn on G6, the Queen retreating. I was looking at playing G5, but the engine's not impressed with this move A5. I mean, the point is that White can just get rid of the Queen on F4, chase it back, and then actually this pawn, you've just moved it to a place where it's easily attacked by the knight. You're also losing control of F5, so these knights are going to move round to. This was one of the lines that the engines were looking at there, Knight ED4. Yeah, you're also going to get Knight F5 in eventually. So, I mean, it looks terrible, ugly, but actually it's quite hard to exploit. And, actually after the game, Garry, and I think in deep thinking as well, Garry was kind of impressed with B5. He saw that B4, B5. It looked odd, but yeah, it wasn't. He didn't feel that it was as bad as you might think. For human commentators, of course, and for me as well at the time, I remember thinking, oh God, what a lunatic, And it's a shame, really, because if I'd been a little bit more open, I might have understood some things about engines a lot earlier than I did. But B5. So Feng-hsiung says, Deep Blue played some moves that were quite strange to human eyes. B5 was both panned and praised by different commentators. Garry himself spoke highly of this move. We did not like the move, and it triggered an evaluation software bug hunt. Joe was the one who finally found it and fixed the bug relating to the move and the corresponding move from game one. So, and Yasser says another amazing decision after denying black the c5 square. It promptly gives it up to launch the ghost of an attack. Things have gone really wrong for Deep Blue, and I now thought that Garry had all the ingredients for victory. I mean, I agree. I mean, this was what I thought at the time as well. So, but actually, it's just not that clear really. It's but you know, the engines want to play a move like like knight a4, for example, queen b8, queen e3. Keep things tight at the back. Maybe play the knight back to b2 just to cover these squares. Maybe look for c4 later. The engines don't particularly like b5, it must be said. After knight dc5, they're giving white minus 0.27, so a slight edge for black. But still, you know, it's not a disastrous move by any means at all. So after queen e3, Garry played a move that's maybe surprising for him somehow, though it is actually a decent move. I mean, he played the move queen f4, which, you know, sort of offers the exchange of queens. When you might think, ooh, you know, king on b1, open pawns, you know, shouldn't we play the queen over to c7? But actually, the engines don't really think so. They think, you know, you play the move knight d4, queen b6, h5, takes, and yeah, you know, black just doesn't really have a very easy way of breaking through, and in the end the engines just think, well, you're going to have to exchange off queens, which, you know, is kind of well, you know, these endings are very similar to the sort of thing that happened in the game. You know, white's got a lot of loose pawns, so you could very easily imagine everything in a human game, certainly everything turning around and you end up losing all your pawns, but you know, an engine's unlikely to fall for that. But actually, I think Garry's move was probably best. I think probably Garry was thinking as well that you know, with the queen can always step over to c4. But in principle, I mean, you're sort of thinking Karpov style, aren't you? That all these weaknesses, all these weak squares, you know, actually maybe you're even technically winning already. Yeah, that's and you never know. It might even be the case against a human player. Again, we see a bit of inefficiency from Deep Blue, and strange. It was sort of you know, it sort of happened at the last moment really, but it took on c6 early, which is a little bit strange really. Because you know, it didn't need to do it immediately, and well, opening up the b file that early, it's definitely going to be black that gets the b file, you know, rather than white there. So it seems a bit odd to do it immediately. But okay, rook d1 played, and you know, the engine's still assessing this at only minus 0.14, so nothing disastrous has been done. And there was a big explosion in the Deep Blue log file just around this point, really doing some big parallel searches, it looked like, and I hadn't seen that stuff in the log before, so just made me wonder how many, you know, how parallel searches were done, or whether this was something to do with suddenly using table bases, getting close to that. I don't know. So yeah, I mean, Garry was very disappointed with himself after the game. You know, he really felt that he had a big advantage here. He played the move king c7, which is quite nice, you know, just sort of giving yourself the option of getting to the b file. And yeah, Deep Blue played the move king a1 here, which Yasser called a perplexing move. You know, white's exposed king dictates that he must trade queens, and in the upcoming ending keep his king close to the centre and play king c1. And well, the engines are saying h5, g5, king c1. So yeah, you know, they're kind of agreeing there with Yasser. But king a1 played, and you know, it's not so bad. I mean, Garry was very disappointed with himself. He said, if I played rook f7 in this position, you know, then I would just have been winning. You know, white doesn't have a single move. That's his idea at the time. Actually, yeah, the engines give it minus 0.56, so you know, they like it, but they still think that, you know, that white can just play stuff like this, knight d4, very similar to what happened in the game, and just sort of vaguely hold it. It's a better endgame for black, but yeah, most likely not enough. I mean, I was sort of more thinking about queen c4, to be honest. I mean, that seemed quite dangerous. But yeah, they just wanted... Yasser gives the line knight d2, But then queen a6 is really strong. You know, you're hitting a3 and you're threatening d4. Oops. But sorry, spilling my coffee there. Eesh. But actually, the engines just want to play the move knight d4, which is quite nice. You know, typical engines just finding a good way to hold stuff. And after queen a6, knight a2. That's the line that they come up with. And yeah, everything's holding together somehow. The rook here is covering the third rank. After knight d4, queen d4, we've got ideas of knight b4. Yeah, we can throw in e6 maybe, and you know, look for this sort of stuff. It's quite yeah, you know, white does have counterplay, even if the position looks very, very ropey. But I wouldn't have guessed it from the start. I am thoroughly with Yasser on this one. But queen e3 was played by Garry, and Garry said he lost his nerve. Exchange queens because my king was exposed and I was running short of time. And it is a bit weird. It's back to minus 0.05. And I mean, of course, Garry knows this there, but it feels weird to swap off queens and just get rid of this weakness on f2. You know, I mean, yeah, that must be helping white quite a bit, really. But Garry played rook f7, and now, yeah, Deep Blue played it very well, actually. And commentators were not really thinking that was the case, sort of really thinking that Deep Blue was not playing well at all, but actually it was just, it was playing as you'd expect, like an engine. This knight going to d4, rook f2, and then a very nice move actually, rook b1 here. Other moves were possible. You could go knight c2, but this is quite a nice counterplay option. It's got a very, very sneaky trap in it. I think this was pointed out by oh yeah, and this is Daniel King pointing this out. He said that Garry told me that this was his original intention. Takes knight e6, and it looks absolutely great, doesn't it? Rook c2, knight d4, and we're just going to clean up. But there's an amazing tactic here, which is that we can go knight d5 cd and rook c3 check, and yeah, suddenly black's in huge problems because we're giving checks on the 7th and 8th, whatever you do. So yeah, you're going to have to work hard not to get mated or lose material or even avoid perpetual checks. So yeah, very nice trap from Deep Blue. Really, you know, exploiting the activity of its pieces to the maximum degree, and that's a move that you know, very reminiscent of modern engines. You know, just you know, really exploiting the dynamic potential there. So Garry played rook g2, and now there are many moves that you can do. Knight e2 was Deep Blue's choice. Rook takes g4. Of course, you know, rook ff2 is very, very natural, but we're just aiming to swap off the knights. And after takes rook e1, and we're behind the e pawn. And well, you can give all sorts of perpetuals, but you can't do any more than that. So rook takes g4 from Garry, and then knight takes c6, knight e6, and knight d4. And yeah, Deep Blue doing this very typical engine stuff of you know, just working out how to trade stuff. And yeah, of course, you know, Deep Blue's got a lot of weak pawns, but so does Garry. So there's a big chance that things will get equalised. And this rook on b1 is stopping the king from escaping easily forwards if you know, it's checked on the 7th. So yeah, you know, and this pawn on e5 is stopping the king escaping to d6. So there's a little bit of a box there, you know, that the black's got to watch out for. So knight takes d4 was played by Garry. I mean, there are plenty of other ideas. Knight d8 is something that the engines were looking at. And yeah, there's just some amazing engine line there. King a2, c5, just rook b5, giving the knight away. And then you've got this trick of rook c3. You can also look to take on d5. And yeah, the engines thought, well, you know, black's just got a bit of a crappy knight, really, and white's going to win lots of pawns. So yeah, very nice idea. But anyway, knight d4 played by Garry, and a very natural move. And now there's all sorts of things you could do, but rook g1 was played by Deep Blue. Rook g6, rook takes c2, rook g7, king b6, and this still looks quite awkward. I mean, obviously we've got a thread of mate on here, and two connected passed pawns. It's the sort of thing that you could imagine engines struggling with. but why it's struggling with rather. But yeah, Deep Blue was did not have a particular problem with that. And actually, after Rook A7, there's a nice threat here. It's a Rook A5 check with checkmate there. And Garry played Rook F1. So it's an interesting moment in actual fact, because at this moment, after Garry's move, Deep Blue self-terminated, crashed. Joe had added in a piece of code, says Feng-hsiung, that monitored the efficiency of the parallel search and terminated the program itself if the efficiency dropped too low. So it got this code was terminated twice. Also happened in game 3, very early in the game after Deep Blue's 8th move. So yeah, I mean, well, the interesting thing there is that when Deep Blue reboots in the log file, you see it going through all its stuff, and well, you seem to be seeing that it's got table bases, and there's also something that gets filled that's called the stiller directory under the file path endgame fs/des files, and I'm guessing that stiller directory refers to Louis Stiller. I looked him up in the programming.org, who did a lot of work of retrograde analysis of endgames. So yeah, I wonder whether there was some sort of special table bases that Deep Blue had access to. I think it had access to 4-man and also some 5-man as well as having stuff in its chess chip that helped it. And oh yeah, Feng-hsiung said that really shocked me. Had access to the 5-piece endgame database online. So yeah, it was going to play endgames like this pretty well. He said the 5-game endgame table base online wasn't used in this game, but yeah, obviously, if it came to it, then Deep Blue would not have had a problem in this endgame. So yeah, you can tell they were using all the stuff. I don't know whether this was used in the 1996 match, by the way. No mention is made of it, so I think this might have been one of the extra chess improvements that they added to it. So Rook B4, threatening checkmate again. Dock Rook C2, Rook B1. Garry finally went for it. I mean, this still looks kind of tricky. Two connected passed pawns, the possibility for the king to advance whilst being shielded by those pawns is quite worrying. But yeah, obviously Deep Blue with that sort of endgame knowledge was not going to make those sort of mistakes. Yeah, I mean, that's quite impressive actually, because yeah, you know, I mean, just from themselves, you know, engines of that time still made quite a few mistakes in endgames, not the monsters that we know nowadays. But yeah, this was very impressive. So Garry played Rook H2. He was yeah, just couldn't calculate a win, but that's not surprising. It just wasn't there. I mean, King D4 was obviously one move that human players and commentators were very interested in. But you just go Rook takes C7, Rook E5, Rook takes C6 check, and there we are. You just push your pawns, and you're going to be fine there. So it all looks scary. Yasser did quite a lot of analysis on it, but yeah, it wasn't leading anywhere. So after Rook H2, Rook H7 played, King C4, and now Rook C7, hitting the C pawn. You go C5, but yeah, the problem is that now if the king advances, then you can take off. So now E6 played, Rook takes H4, E7, Rook E4, and now A4. The other pawn starts marching, and yeah, I mean, basically the black rook can't hold both of them back, and well, anything you do with the king is going to end up just costing some pawns. So King C1 played in this position, I think. Is that right? Or yeah, King C1. So Garry says 6-piece table bases were quite rare at the time, so I was surprised to read the Deep Blues contained 6 selected positions with 6 pieces they had specially requisitioned from an expert. Louis Stiller? You never know, you never know. Yeah, this isn't mentioned by Feng-hsiung. He just mentions the 5-piece table base online, so that would be quite interesting to know. But after king c1 here, I think, was the game agreed drawn in this position? I think it was. This is the engine line: king b4, a5, king b5, a6, and then you take off, and then the engine say, we'll make the table base draw. Rook takes c5, and obviously this is just a complete draw. The white king's in front of the pawn, so no problems there. So very interesting game there. I mean, you know, Garry was on top. Garry was the one pushing, and he sort of got to, you know, to some sort of interesting looking advantage, but didn't quite manage it. I mean, what I was, you know, what I found quite striking was, first of all, that, yeah, I suppose human input was probably robbing Deep Blue of its natural inclination, which would have been to gain space, which would have been very strong in the opening. We also saw this, I suppose, this slight inefficiency that Deep Blue has, just to, you know, release tension quite early, exchange pieces off quite early as well, when you might actually wait. But I was very impressed by, you know, how dynamic Deep Blue was in looking for, you know, for counterplay, not just sitting around and letting it all happen. And then, yeah, and the rest of the game, yeah, this move b4 to b5 obviously was very strange, but yeah, I think it's, you know, caused a little bit by this bug Feng-hsiung mentions. And as I said, my interpretation of it is that king safety is important to Deep Blue, unless it sees the opportunity to weaken the opponent's king, and then it sort of just completely forgets about its own king safety. So, you know, that sort of randomized the game a little bit. But yeah, I mean, Deep Blue's play was, you know, was very impressive in the whole endgame phase there. And yeah, this sort of dynamic play, you know, just defending with rook b1 with this idea of bringing the rook over to c3 somehow was very, very nice. And of course, yeah, endgame table base is definitely going to help when you're getting down to those rook and pawn endgames. So yeah, you know, just a very interesting game. Garry's still on top, but not able to do anything. Game still always within the boundary of a draw. It was time to move on to game 5, Garry's last white of the match. What would he do?